Salisbury, Maryland, was the kind of town where secrets stayed hidden, tucked away behind white picket fences and manicured lawns. It was a place where the hum of everyday life rarely rose above a whisper, and everyone knew each other by name, if not intimately by story. Dr. Meredith Larson, a 65-year-old physician, had long been a respected fixture in this quiet community. To her patients, she was the caring doctor, the one who remembered birthdays and lent a sympathetic ear to their woes. To her colleagues, she was the epitome of professionalism, dedicated to her practice, and always prepared to help. But Meredith had secrets of her own. It all began to unravel one crisp autumn morning when the local news reported a shocking incident. Aaron Cole, a 26-year-old local artist known for his vivid, almost chaotic paintings, had been found dead in his studio. The authorities had initially considered his death an unfortunate accident, possibly a tragic overdose, but there was something about the scene that didn't sit right. Aaron's neighbors, who'd grown used to his late-night music and the lights that burned until dawn, had noticed an uncharacteristic quietness for days. As the news spread, a dark undercurrent of speculation took root in the community. Aaron's death wasn't just a random misfortune, it was the first thread in a tapestry of deception and obsession that would ultimately drag Meredith Larson into the spotlight. Meredith had always been a woman of composure. She had spent 4 decades in the medical field, building her reputation one patient at a time, quietly sacrificing personal happiness for her career. As retirement loomed, however, she found herself alone, with her 2 children living on opposite coasts and a husband who had left years ago. Her evenings were empty, filled with reruns on TV, old photo albums, and glass after glass of wine. Despite her accomplishments, the quietness of her life echoed too loudly in her mind. It was during this vulnerable period that Matthew Granger walked into her office. He was 31, fit, and charming in an uncomplicated way, a personal trainer who had hurt his shoulder during a workout session. He was outgoing and warm, with a quick smile that could light up a room. After several therapy sessions, the dynamic between Meredith and Matthew began to shift. The doctor-patient boundary blurred, first with casual compliments, then with suggestive jokes, until, one evening, it dissolved completely. Meredith had never imagined herself capable of such a breach of trust, but Matthew made her feel something she hadn't in years. Wanted. The initial thrill of secrecy, the stolen touches, the late-night rendezvous, felt like a second chance at youth. For a moment, she forgot she was a respected doctor on the brink of retirement. She felt alive again, vibrant, and reckless. Matthew, however, wasn't just looking for affection. As weeks turned into months, his demeanor began to change. He became possessive, calling Meredith incessantly, showing up unannounced at her clinic, demanding her attention even when she was with other patients. It was a passionate but dangerous game, and Meredith knew it. She tried to end things, to re-establish the line she had crossed, but Matthew wasn't ready to let go. He threatened to reveal their affair, to tell everyone exactly who Dr. Meredith Larson really was. Amid this chaos, another patient entered Meredith's life, Daniel Ward. Daniel was not like Matthew. He was 28, soft-spoken, and fragile. He had been battling anxiety and depression for most of his adult life, a struggle that had left him isolated and fearful. Meredith had treated him for nearly a year, but it wasn't until after her involvement with Matthew that she truly noticed how broken Daniel was. He needed someone to care, someone to listen, and Meredith provided just that. At first, it was just extended appointments where Daniel could talk, and she would listen, offering not only medical advice but also emotional support. Slowly, those sessions stretched into personal meetings outside the clinic, coffee at a local cafe, walks in the park. Daniel, too, became dependent on Meredith, but unlike Matthew, his was a dependency born of desperation. He needed her to keep his fears at bay, and in her own way, Meredith needed him as well. He was attentive, grateful, and unlike Matthew, he didn't make her feel threatened. But dependency is a dangerous substitute for love. Daniel's attachment soon grew obsessive. He would panic if Meredith didn't answer his messages immediately, and his fear of losing her turned into erratic behavior. He became suspicious of anyone else who might occupy her time, and Meredith, feeling the strain, began to realize the full extent of what she had gotten herself into. It was at this delicate juncture that Aaron Cole became the final piece in Meredith's unraveling. Aaron was different from both Matthew and Daniel. A young artist, passionate and often unstable, he exuded a raw energy that intrigued Meredith. He had come to her office originally for a routine checkup, but their conversations quickly drifted away from health. Aaron spoke of his art, his struggle to express himself, his fascination with the boundaries of life and death. He saw Meredith as his muse, someone who could understand his chaotic view of the world. Meredith, captivated by his youth and his recklessness, let herself be drawn into his world. She visited his studio, watched as he painted, and before long, became part of his work, his obsession. Aaron's passion was intoxicating but frightening. He spoke in riddles, painted dark, stormy canvases that seemed to mirror his internal turmoil. He began to talk of his love for her, an all-consuming love that frightened Meredith more than anything she had faced before. The tension between the three men, the possessive Matthew, the emotionally unstable Daniel, and the volatile Aaron, began to build, a ticking time bomb that Meredith could not defuse. They each wanted her in their own way, each believing they had a claim on her. Aaron, increasingly erratic, began to make threats. He hinted that he knew about Matthew, about Daniel, and that he would tell. Meredith tried to calm him, to reason with him, but Aaron's obsession was beyond reason. One night, after a particularly intense argument in his studio, Aaron vanished. For 2 days, there was no word from him. And then, he was found, dead from an apparent overdose. The pills were scattered around his body, his last work, a half-finished portrait of Meredith, still on the easel. The community was shocked, but for Meredith, the shock was layered with fear. Aaron had threatened to expose her, and now he was gone. As the investigation into Aaron's death began, Meredith's carefully constructed world started to come apart at the seams. It was Daniel who came forward, his hands trembling as he confessed to having been there that night. He hadn't meant for Aaron to die, he claimed. He had tried to help calm Aaron down, had given him the pills to ease his panic, but Aaron had taken more, far more than he should have. With Aaron dead, and Daniel confessing, Meredith found herself at the center of a storm she could no longer control. The community that had once respected her now looked at her with suspicion. And Matthew, still lurking in the background, watched as her life began to crumble. The death of Aaron Cole sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Salisbury. For most, the young artist was a peculiar figure, his art loud and often misunderstood, yet undeniably captivating. His sudden demise, especially under such suspicious circumstances, quickly became the talk of the town. Whispers about a possible overdose circled among neighbors, and then came murmurs of something darker, something that hinted at foul play. Detective Clara Hayes was assigned to the case, a seasoned officer known for her tenacity. Clara didn't buy the story of a simple overdose. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies. For one, Aaron wasn't known to indulge in drugs to that extent. He had his vices, alcohol and perhaps an occasional joint, but nothing on the scale of the pill overdose that killed him. It wasn't long before Clara's investigation led her to Dr. Meredith Larson. Meredith had tried to distance herself from the chaos, retreating into her work and attempting to put up a front of normalcy. But it wasn't easy. The clinic felt emptier now, every room holding echoes of Aaron's laughter or Daniel's earnest confessions. The reminders of her indiscretions weighed heavily on her, but Meredith had not yet grasped how deeply her life was about to unravel. One afternoon, as she finished with a routine patient, she found Detective Hayes waiting for her in her office. Clara was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through the air between them. She introduced herself and asked if Meredith had some time for a few questions. Meredith swallowed hard but nodded, inviting the detective to sit. Clara began with simple questions: how Meredith knew Aaron, what their relationship was, when she had last seen him. Meredith answered as best she could without exposing the intimate details of her entanglement. She described Aaron as a patient, an artist she had grown fond of, someone who had struggled with his mental health. Clara nodded politely, jotting down notes, but Meredith could feel the skepticism in her gaze, an unspoken understanding that there was more to the story. While Meredith grappled with the questioning, Daniel was struggling with his own guilt. Aaron's death had left him in pieces. He had not intended for things to spiral out of control, he had just wanted Aaron to calm down, to stop threatening Meredith. Daniel had brought the pills to Aaron's studio in a misguided attempt to help. Aaron had been frantic, angry and erratic, and Daniel thought he could ease the situation. But Aaron, in his rage, had taken pill after pill, and Daniel, frozen with fear, had done nothing to stop him. Unable to bear the weight of his actions, Daniel had turned himself in to the police, desperate to explain what had happened. The detectives listened as Daniel described the chaotic night in Aaron's studio, the yelling, the broken glass, the pills spilling across the floor. Clara Hayes knew Daniel wasn't the real villain, he was a pawn, manipulated by circumstances beyond his control, and perhaps, by a woman who had led them all down a dangerous path. Detective Hayes sensed there was another layer to the story, something Daniel wasn't saying. She prodded, gently at first, about his relationship with Dr. Larson, and Daniel, with tears in his eyes, began to talk. He spoke of how Meredith had been there for him, how she was more than just a doctor, how he had fallen in love with her. He explained that Aaron had threatened to expose her, that he was going to ruin everything, and Daniel couldn't let that happen. The confession painted a clear picture of an inappropriate relationship, but it also hinted at the power dynamics at play. Clara could see that Daniel was not just a perpetrator, he was also a victim of Meredith's influence. The next time Detective Hayes visited Meredith, the tone of the conversation was different. There was an edge to Clara's voice, a challenge as she laid out what she had learned from Daniel. Meredith listened, her heart pounding as Clara described Daniel's version of events, how he had tried to protect her, how Aaron had become a threat, and how his obsession had ended in tragedy. Meredith felt the walls closing in around her. She knew she had crossed boundaries, but she had never intended for it to lead to death. She tried to maintain her composure, but Clara's questions hit too close to home. Did she encourage Aaron's feelings? Did she know he was unstable? What exactly did she say to Daniel that made him think Aaron needed to be dealt with? Meredith denied any wrongdoing beyond the affairs, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was murky even to her. She had been playing a dangerous game, manipulating the affections of these men, using their desires to fill the emptiness in her own life. Somewhere along the way, she had lost control, not only of them but of herself. The questioning left Meredith shaken. She returned to her apartment that evening and found Matthew waiting for her. He was drunk, angry, demanding answers about what was happening. He had heard about Aaron's death, about Daniel's confession, and now he wanted to know where Meredith stood. She tried to calm him, but Matthew was beyond reasoning. He accused her of leading him on, of using him just like she had used the others. The argument escalated, and for the first time, Meredith felt genuinely afraid of what Matthew might do. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her skin, and she screamed at him to leave. The neighbors must have heard, because moments later there was a pounding on the door, and Matthew, realizing the trouble he was in, finally let go and stormed out. Meredith sank to the floor after he left, her body shaking with sobs. Everything was falling apart. Aaron was dead. Daniel had implicated her in his death. And now Matthew, the man who had first drawn her into this web of deceit, had turned on her too. The community's perception of Dr. Larson began to shift as the investigation progressed. Rumors spread quickly, and it wasn't long before patients started canceling appointments, and her colleagues began to distance themselves. The friendly greetings she was used to in the halls of the clinic were replaced with cold stares and whispered conversations. She could feel the judgment, the disdain from people who once respected her. Clara Hayes, meanwhile, was building her case. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but the confessions from Daniel, the inappropriate relationships, and the dangerous dynamics between the three men painted a damning picture. Meredith wasn't a cold-blooded murderer, but she had played a pivotal role in the chaos that led to Aaron's death. Eventually, Clara approached the district attorney with her findings. They decided to charge Meredith with gross negligence and professional misconduct, arguing that her actions had directly contributed to the circumstances of Aaron's death. She was stripped of her medical license, her career and reputation in tatters. Meredith's trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with reporters and townspeople eager to witness the fall of the once respected doctor. The prosecution painted her as manipulative, a woman who had used her position to exploit vulnerable young men, whose reckless behavior had cost a life. The defense tried to portray her as lonely, misguided, but ultimately not criminally liable for Aaron's overdose. In the end, Meredith avoided a prison sentence. The jury found her guilty of gross negligence, but not of any intentional wrongdoing. She was sentenced to probation and community service, a small mercy that did little to repair the damage done to her life. The medical board, however, was less forgiving. Her license was permanently revoked, and she would never practice medicine again. The aftermath of the trial left Meredith a broken woman. She had lost her career, her reputation, and the respect of the community she had served for decades. Her relationships with Matthew and Daniel had collapsed under the weight of their dysfunction, leaving her utterly alone. Daniel, overwhelmed with guilt, moved away from Salisbury, hoping to find some semblance of peace far from the memories of what had happened. Matthew disappeared as well, his anger at Meredith leaving him estranged from everyone they had once known. Meredith remained, a ghost of her former self, haunting the empty halls of her apartment, staring at the diplomas on the wall that no longer meant anything. The echoes of her past decisions reverberated in the silence of her solitary life, a constant reminder of the dangerous line she had crossed, and the lives that had been destroyed as a result. Life after the verdict was a hollow shell of what Meredith Larson had known. The once esteemed doctor, the woman who had spent decades in service to her community, was now a pariah. The whispers followed her everywhere, at the grocery store, in the park, even when she dared to step into the local diner. Eyes would avert, voices would hush, and people would cross the street to avoid her. She was Salisbury's shame, the cautionary tale that parents used to warn their children about the dangers of trust. The modest home that Meredith had once treasured for its comfort now felt like a prison. The walls were closing in, the familiar pictures and certificates mere reminders of the life she had destroyed. Her only solace was the garden. She spent hours kneeling in the dirt, planting and pruning, as though tending to the flowers could somehow cultivate a new beginning for herself. It was a flimsy distraction, but it was the only thing that kept her from dwelling on the echoes of her mistakes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Meredith was startled by a knock at the door. Her heart lurched. A late visitor was never a good sign these days. She hesitated before opening it, her hand trembling as she turned the handle. On the doorstep stood Daniel. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken as though the weight of what had happened was eating him alive from the inside out. He hadn't left town like she had heard, but had instead been hiding in plain sight, consumed by guilt and unable to leave. The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, a painful recognition passing between them. Meredith stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him in. Inside, Daniel fidgeted, his gaze wandering across the room, avoiding Meredith's eyes. He looked smaller somehow, less like the young man she had once known. He had come seeking closure, though he wasn't sure how to find it. After a few moments of awkward quiet, he finally spoke. "I can't sleep, Meredith," Daniel began, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I see Aaron every time I close my eyes. I hear him. I keep thinking if I'd done something different, if I'd just called for help, things wouldn't have ended this way." Meredith closed her eyes, the ache in her chest spreading. She had been avoiding these thoughts for months, trying to bury them in work around the house, in her gardening. But now, with Daniel here, the reality of what had happened resurfaced, clear and undeniable. "It's not your fault, Daniel," she said, her voice cracking. "You were trying to help, you were only trying to help." He looked at her then, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But it is my fault, Meredith. And it's yours too. We were both part of it. I loved you, but I see now that I didn't know what that even meant. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just," he stopped, swallowing hard. "I was just ruining everything." Meredith reached out, her fingers brushing against his shoulder in a gesture that was meant to comfort, but Daniel flinched, stepping back. There was nothing left between them now but the cold, stark reality of what they had lost. The affection that had once bound them together was now tainted beyond repair. Daniel stood up abruptly. "I came here to say goodbye, Meredith. I'm leaving Salisbury. I can't be here anymore. I need to move on, if that's even possible." He paused, looking down at her. "I hope you find some peace too. Somehow." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Meredith alone once more. She sat there, staring at the empty space where Daniel had stood, and for the first time since the trial, she allowed herself to cry, truly cry, for Aaron, for Daniel, for Matthew, and for the woman she used to be. After Daniel's departure, the days blurred together for Meredith. The isolation grew thicker, the silence of her house deafening. She was haunted not just by memories, but by the stillness of her present, a life that seemed to be unraveling without any clear end. One afternoon, as she pruned a wilting rose bush in her garden, a shadow fell across her. She looked up, startled, to find Matthew standing on the edge of her yard. He looked different, leaner, his face marked by the rough lines of stress and anger that had festered over the past few months. The sight of him made her stomach twist in fear and regret. "What are you doing here, Matthew?" Meredith's voice was steady, though her heart raced. The last time they'd seen each other, their encounter had nearly ended in violence, and she wasn't eager for a repeat. Matthew stared at her, his jaw tight. "I came because I need answers," he said. "I need to know why you did it, Meredith. Why you played us all like that." Meredith straightened up, setting down her pruning shears. "I never meant to hurt anyone, Matthew. I was lonely. It was wrong, but I didn't set out to manipulate you, or Daniel, or Aaron." Matthew let out a bitter laugh, stepping closer. "Lonely? That's your excuse? Do you have any idea what you did to us? To me? You made me think I was important, and then you just discarded me." She met his eyes, seeing the pain there, pain she had caused. I'm sorry, Matthew. I can't change what happened. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, tense and heavy. And then, Matthew's expression softened, though it was laced with exhaustion. I don't even know what I wanted, coming here, he admitted, his shoulders sagging. I wanted you to know what you did. How much it hurt. Meredith nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. I do know, Matthew. And I'm sorry. Matthew stared at her for a moment longer before he turned and walked away. Meredith watched until he disappeared from view, and she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She was left alone once more, with only the rustle of the wind through the leaves to keep her company. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Meredith began to adjust to her new reality. She accepted that she was no longer Dr. Larson, the respected physician. She was simply Meredith, a flawed, broken woman trying to piece her life back together. She started volunteering at a local shelter, not because she thought it would erase what she had done, but because she needed something, anything, to fill the emptiness inside her. At the shelter, Meredith found a small measure of purpose again. She worked quietly, sorting donations, preparing meals, talking to people who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She found herself listening to others in a way she hadn't before, truly listening, without expectation or judgment. One day, as she was helping an elderly woman find clothes that fit, she heard someone call her name. She turned, surprised to see Detective Clara Hayes standing in the doorway. Clara approached, her expression unreadable. Meredith, she said, her voice softer than Meredith remembered. I heard you were working here. I just wanted to see how you were doing. Meredith blinked, unsure of what to say. I'm managing, she finally replied. Trying to make amends, I guess. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the room. People talk, you know. They say you're doing a lot of good here. Maybe that doesn't change what happened, but it's something. Meredith looked down, a sad smile tugging at her lips. It's all I can do now. Clara was silent for a moment, then she reached out, placing a hand on Meredith's shoulder. Take care of yourself, Meredith. We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after. With that, Clara turned and left, leaving Meredith standing there, her heart heavy yet strangely lighter. Maybe she couldn't undo the past. Maybe she couldn't bring Aaron back or heal the wounds she had caused Daniel and Matthew. But she could move forward, one small step at a time, trying to be better, trying to make something meaningful out of the pieces that were left. And for Meredith Larson, that was enough. It had to be. Salisbury was a town that never truly forgot, and for Meredith Larson, that meant every day was a struggle against the invisible chains of her past. It was as though her mistakes were etched into the sidewalks she walked, painted on the walls of every building. People still looked at her as the disgraced doctor, the woman who had crossed lines no one else dared. But there were small victories in her new life, moments that offered hope for a future that, while uncertain, wasn't entirely bleak. One such moment came during an ordinary afternoon at the shelter. Meredith was serving food when she noticed a young woman standing hesitantly at the doorway. She was no older than 20, with dark circles under her eyes and a fearful expression, her clothes worn and her gaze avoiding those around her. Meredith approached her, offering a gentle smile. Hello, I'm Meredith. Would you like something to eat? The girl looked at her, her gaze hardening at first, a defense mechanism, no doubt, but then something in Meredith's demeanor must have reassured her, because she nodded, taking a step forward. Meredith guided her to a seat, serving her some soup and bread. They didn't speak at first, but after a while, the girl introduced herself as Emily. Emily's story came out in fragments: a troubled home, a series of bad decisions, and a desperate flight from a life she couldn't bear anymore. Meredith listened, nodding quietly, her heart aching for this young woman who reminded her, in many ways, of Daniel and Aaron. Here was another person at a crossroads, another soul that could go either way. Meredith found herself speaking without even thinking. "I've made mistakes too, Emily. Some that I can't ever take back, but I'm trying to be better. It's hard, and some days it feels impossible. But you don't have to do it alone. You can start over, one small step at a time." Emily didn't respond right away, but the hardness in her eyes seemed to soften. She stayed at the shelter for the rest of the day, and when she left, she looked back at Meredith, giving her a small nod, one that was almost imperceptible, but to Meredith, it meant everything. It was a nod of understanding, of shared pain, and maybe even the faintest glimmer of hope. For Matthew Granger, the months following the confrontation with Meredith were tumultuous. He had left Salisbury, drifting from place to place, trying to outrun the rage and betrayal that burned inside him. He found work as a fitness instructor in a gym a few towns over, but it wasn't the same. He missed the familiarity of Salisbury, even if that familiarity had become poisoned by the memories of what had happened. But the distance gave Matthew something he hadn't had before: perspective. Slowly, the red-hot anger that had consumed him began to cool. He could see the mistakes for what they were, see how his own choices had led him to that place of hurt and disillusionment. He had pursued Meredith, thinking he could control the relationship, thinking it was love when it was really more about validation, about feeling needed and important. One day, Matthew found himself back in Salisbury, standing outside the gym where he used to train. He hadn't planned to come back, his car had simply seemed to steer itself there. He stood there for a long time, looking at the place that had once been his whole world. And then he walked away, not with the feeling of loss he expected, but with a sense of closure. There was nothing for him in Salisbury anymore, but that wasn't a bad thing. It was time to find something new, to build a life that wasn't tied to the mistakes of his past. And so, Matthew got back in his car, the engine rumbling to life as he drove away, leaving Salisbury and its ghosts behind. For Daniel Ward, leaving Salisbury had not been easy. He had no family left to support him, and his mental health had been shaky even before everything happened with Meredith and Aaron. But moving away was the first step he needed to begin healing. He ended up in a small town in Pennsylvania, where no one knew who he was, where the events of Salisbury weren't whispered about in every corner. Daniel found work at a bookstore, a quiet place where he could hide among the shelves, finding solace in the smell of old paper and the comfort of stories that weren't his own. It was there that he began writing his thoughts down, at first just to get them out of his head, to put them somewhere that wasn't festering inside of him. But the more he wrote, the more he found a strange kind of catharsis. He wrote about Aaron, about his laughter, his art, the way he had lived so intensely and died so tragically. He wrote about Meredith, how she had been both a beacon of hope and a source of destruction. And he wrote about himself, the choices he had made, the things he wished he had done differently. One evening, as Daniel was closing up the bookstore, he received a letter, handwritten, with no return address. It was from Meredith. She wrote that she hoped he was well, that she understood why he needed to leave. She apologized again for her role in everything, and she wished him peace. Daniel sat with the letter for a long time, tears slipping down his face. There was no anger left anymore, only a deep sadness for everything they had all lost. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for both of them to heal, even if it had to be apart. For Meredith, each day was still a challenge. She worked at the shelter, planted flowers in her garden, and tried her best to move forward. She had long since stopped hoping that Salisbury would ever forgive her. The town's judgment was something she had to live with, a scar that would never quite fade. But she was learning to forgive herself, one small step at a time. One afternoon, as Meredith worked at the shelter, Emily returned, this time with a timid smile on her face. She had found a job, she said, at a diner across town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meredith smiled back, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time, pride. Not in herself, but in Emily, in this young woman who had found the strength to start over. And maybe, Meredith thought, that was the only redemption she could ever hope for, not erasing the mistakes of her past, but helping others avoid making the same ones. If she could give Emily a chance at a better future, then maybe, just maybe, the broken pieces of her own life would mean something after all. The sun was setting over Salisbury, the sky streaked with hues of pink and orange. Meredith sat on her porch, a cup of tea in her hands, watching as the light slowly faded. She thought of Aaron, of his art that was full of fire and passion. She thought of Daniel, of his quiet kindness and his desperate need to belong. She thought of Matthew, with his strength and his vulnerability, and she thought of the person she used to be, the doctor who had once believed she was untouchable. She wasn't that person anymore. She wasn't Dr. Meredith Larson, the respected physician. She was simply Meredith, a woman who had made terrible mistakes, who had hurt people she cared about, but who was still here, still trying to do better. As the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Meredith closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't bring Aaron back, couldn't undo the hurt she had caused. But she could be here, in this moment, doing what she could to help, to heal, not just herself, but those around her. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.